It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Salman Akhtar. Dr. Akhtar was born in India and completed his medical and psychiatric education there. Upon arriving in the U.S. in 1973, he repeated his psychiatric training at the University of Virginia School of Medicine, and then obtained psychoanalytic training from Philadelphia Psychoanalytic Institute. Currently, he is professor of psychiatry at Jefferson Medical College and a training and supervising analyst at the Psychoanalytic Center of Philadelphia. His more than 300 publications include 16 books, as well as 47 edited or co-edited volumes in psychiatry and psychoanalysis. I had to keep updating the number of books because they kept publishing while I was writing this. He has served on the editorial boards of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis and the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. He also has published 8 collections of poetry written in both Urdu and English, and serves as a scholar in residence at the Interact Theater Company in Philadelphia. In my recent interview for the group Circle with Dr. Akhtar, I asked what issues are important in our clinical work with minorities. He said, quote, "The most important thing to do is to strive toward cultural neutrality. This requires developing an attitude that no religion, no race, no ethnicity, no nationality, no language, no attire, no food, no music, and no ritual is inherently superior to another. It is not easy to accomplish this since all of us are vulnerable to idealizing, secretly or openly, our own traditions, and to regard those of others as somehow peculiar or even inferior," end quote. I regularly see how challenging this is, even on the home front, when I enter into some silly conflict with my immigrant husband. The title of Dr. Akhtar's talk today is "The Mental Pain of Minorities, Social and Clinical Aspects." Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't think that's familiar. Thank you very much for having me here. And I'm very impressed by the attendance. It's just amazing. You know, in most meetings, not so many people show up, especially, obviously you're doing something good, you know. I myself was a bit late, and some people on the podium were worried whether I had died in the hotel room. So I have news for you, and that is, I am alive. All right, here it is. Now, when I came to this country, I was often asked by patients this question, where are you from? Now, 43 years later, I don't have a single patient, a clinical encounter, in which a patient asks me, where are you from? So the question is, why not? Why not? I don't really know the answer to this question, but I have some hypothesis as to why is it that nobody now ever says to me when I'm interviewing a new patient, where are you from? Nobody. Why? I think there are 3 or 4 things responsible for it. One is that the country has changed. The demography of the country has changed. It was exotic and unusual to be from India in 1973, especially when I was in Virginia. It is no longer an unusual thing, you know. So that's one thing. The demography of the country has changed. Secondly, because I'm seeing more educated, more affluent patients who are more knowledgeable about the world, so maybe the patient population of my own has changed. That's a second possibility. Third possibility is that I'm more comfortably here. Not 100%, but you know, but more comfortably. Let's say, I would say about 79.2%. You know, which is as good, as good as it gets for immigrant people. But finally, I think beyond these three factors, which are not bad, I think they are operative, but the most important one, I think, is that I've become a better doctor, a better therapist. I think when a patient comes, the patient is interested in their problems, in their suffering, in finding solutions to, and finding somebody who can listen to them carefully, differently, and in a way that creates optimism and the possibility that the difficulties can more or less be overcome. If the patient finds that in the therapist's office, the patient does not notice where the therapist is from, what's the skin color of the therapist, whether the therapist has an accent, and such. It is only when the patient does not feel appropriately held in attention and also not properly attended to, then the person begins to be curious as to where the person is from, which is a polite way of saying that you don't understand me. That's one thing. So I was as much of a minority as I was, and I still am, and yet the perception of other people has changed, and my own perception has changed. Second example, and this is mind-boggling that this just happened about, I think about 6 weeks ago. 6, 7, 8 weeks ago, I was alone at home, so I decided to go out after work, not go home straight, and decided to go to a very fine, very nice bar to watch the Republican debate. And it was a relatively fancy place. So I sat there, and it was the second debate. It was just about to come on. A man who looked a cheap replica of Alfred Hitchcock was sitting next to me. And he asked me the following question: do you watch our debates? And I didn't know. I had to think how to respond. So I said, excuse me, I didn't understand what you mean by our. Oh, he says, I apologize. I meant, do you watch these debates, political debates? I said, yes. There was silence. I'm watching, he's watching. A few minutes later, he says, are you an American? I said, did I ask you whether you were an American? How come you ask me and I don't ask you? Can you explain this to me? He said, I really, really apologize. I didn't mean anything. I didn't mean anything bad. About 10 minutes in the debate, the man turns to me, says, you live in the United States, don't you? I said, I'm going to ask you to go in your pocket, take out your wallet, show me your driver's license, let me see your address, then I'll tell you where I live. This is utterly mind-boggling. I thought this was over. But you know what? This is not over. This is not over, as lots and lots of people in this audience know. It's not over. Minorities have their problems and their difficulties, just the way majority has its own problems. But what is a minority? It's not easy to define. If you look at the dictionary definition, open any decent dictionary and you'll find 3 or 4 different definitions of it. One of them has to do with being a minor. So minority means being below 18 or 21 years of age. That could be a definition of minority. Another definition is, in a given population, the smaller number of people, which is the usual meaning we take of the word minority. Another definition has to do with, in a given committee, the smaller opinion and the vote that is given to an opinion, and the smaller votes in a given committee or given institution or given organization, which has nothing to do with population representation. because in a committee there might be majority people only, and yet two of them are minority because they are taking a minority opinion or a smaller opinion, an opinion represented by less people. Also, there's some implication in the most dictionary definition that people who have some difference from others, which is a euphemism for prejudice, some difference from others are a minority. So there are many definitions. Generally speaking, our temptation, of course, is to think of numbers. People who are less in numbers are called minority. That is true, but that is also not true. When the British were ruling India, trust me, there were more Indians in India. And trust me, the British did not think of themselves as a minority. The same thing is true in South Africa. In many countries, women outnumber men, and yet, because of disenfranchisement, because of economic inequality, they belong to minorities. In the Islamic world, only 19% of Muslims of the world are Arabs. However, only 19%, 81% of Muslims are not Arabs. However, because Quran is written in Arabic, because the holiest sites of Islam are in Saudi Arabia, and because, by God, they have a lot of money. Therefore, and oil, they don't regard themselves, and many Muslims do not regard Arabs as a minority Muslims. So, number of people is applicable and is not applicable. I think a better definition of minority is not related to mere numerical representation. A better definition is minority represents that group which is weaker in social praxis, which has less access to doing things and bringing changes about in the society, which is subject to economic disparity and inequality, and which has lesser political representation. It is not a statistical definition, I think, who's minority and who's not minority. I think it's a political definition, and social definition, and economic definition. Now, people live in this state of economic disparity, in weaker social praxis, and lesser political representation. It is hurtful to live that way. When you live that way every day, you can be consciously aware of it. Because if you're consciously aware of it every day, you'll be in too much pain. Therefore, the pain has to be removed from consciousness. But it cannot be repressed. So it is also not unconscious. It is, in the earlier model of Freud, the topographic model, pre-conscious, which means, just like the name of the street on which you live, where was it in your mind? Now it is in your mind. It is now in your conscious mind. A second ago, it was in the pre-conscious. Or, for example, our children. Those of us who have children, we never forget that we have children. We may not be thinking about them consciously, but they are always in our mind. They're always in our mind. And that is in the pre-conscious. Same way, belonging to a minority status is not an unconscious phenomenon. It may not be conscious, but it's always in the pre-conscious, and hence can be readily brought to surface. In 1974, while driving through rural Virginia, I was stopped by a cop. Perhaps I was driving fast. Likely, I'm not saying that I was innocent, although I like to say. But the cop stopped me, asked me very politely, "May I please have your driver's license, registration?" I gave him that. And he started filling a ticket. And I think at some point, there must be on that form a question of race. And he was very puzzled. And he asked me, "What are you?" The answer to this is, shit happens. Do you see? So in this state, what happens is, Freud had a concept called Seelen tremors, which meant mental pain. Mental pain. In a footnote, in Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, Freud says there are 3 reactions to separation. One reaction to separation is that when the ego, which he was using alternately as a specific agency of the mind and as the whole self, when the self and the object, which is a bad word to use for human beings, but that's how it is. So, when the self and object, self does not need the object, does not need it, but wants it. Then there's a separation that causes sadness, longing, missing, mourning. At a deeper level, if the relationship is such that the self cannot be coherent without the object's presence, that we see sometimes in some borderline patients, then the object's moving away causes separateness anxiety. A word that, and Fred Pine, for whom I have great respect, he specifically says the word separation anxiety is not a good word because it can mean 200 things. It's an external phenomena. It should be called separateness anxiety. That's the second. And at a deepest level, where the self does not recognize that the object is not a part of me. For example, our hands, our face, those people whom we take for granted as internally and deeply related to us. When that person moves away, then Freud is writing, and there's a dash. Meaning, for a second, he cannot think of what to call this phenomena and experience. And then he writes, that experience is called Seelen tremors, pain of the soul. For example, if your child appears here, and you say, "What are you doing here?" And she says, "Who are you?" You say, I'm your mom." She says, "No, you're not my mother." You're not going to feel missing and longing and sadness. You're not going to feel anxiety. What you're going to feel is pain. Pain. Because you consider your child as a part of yourself. And the child amputates you by saying, "You're not my mother." The minority, born and raised in the same nation, over generations and hundreds of years, is made to feel, "You're not my child." The land says, "You're not my child." And therefore it causes Seelen tremors to the minority. Now, there are all sorts of areas in which this situation pops up. The first is the presence of minority itself. Minorities exist. Minorities exist everywhere. There are racial minorities, religious minorities, gender minorities, sexual orientation minorities, linguistic minorities, economic minorities. Minorities exist everywhere. The interesting thing is that they are not wanted by the majority, but they are needed by the majority. Now, this puts one in a very awkward situation. Imagine yourself in a relationship with another person or a group where the person doesn't want you, but needs you. That puts you in a very awkward situation. Every majority needs a minority. In order to externalize, in order to take away and repudiate their own internal problems and put it into somebody else. Think about, what do we have prejudices against? Oral drive derivatives. These people eat too much. These people eat sloppily. These people eat wrong things. Anal drive derivatives. These people are filthy. They don't take shower. They smell. Phallic drive derivatives. These people are cocky, exhibitionistic. Oedipus complex derivatives, these people have no sexual boundaries, no prohibitions, they'll do anything. All of this are human tendencies present in all of us. But if they are present too much, and if the attack against them within is too great, then these things have to be put outside. We don't have this, they have this. The majority needs a minority. Two countries that are based upon the idea that people of same religion can live happily ever after were created for that reason. Not came about, but created. Israel and Pakistan. Both, one would think that there would be complete bliss because the minority has now found themselves in a majority status and there'll be no problem. And people will be living happily ever after. But that's not the case. In those countries also, there are groups trying to label somebody else as a minority, somebody else as the source of the problem within the country. There's always a need for externalization. Freud says at one place, I've always needed a close friend and a hated enemy. What he did not say was that often a close friend, especially if he was very smart, became a hated enemy. But that's how it is. All of us need, like I have a small mind experiment, and that is if you are getting bored terribly and don't know what the hell to do one Sunday afternoon, and you are with your partner in your house, I recommend the following exercise. Think of a person that you really dislike, that your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife also dislikes. Begin talking about that person. Very soon, the mood in the house will lift. And yes, it's a good thing. And you will feel, both of you will start feeling such love for each other. That's always the case. That's always the case. The majority needs a minority, but does not want it. That is one situation. So that is the presence. Then the other thing is the minority is present. You can see people who look different from you, who speak different from you. They are always there. They are present. But they are only present in flesh and blood. They are not present in movies. They are not present. There's a big, right now, a big protest against the Oscar ceremony because of lack of diversity, and against the whatever is the National or Film Association thing about pretty much absence of Latinos in films. You know, so that they're not present in movies, they're not present on television, they're not present on dollar bills, they're not present on streets, signs, and building names, and so on and so forth. You know, so that they're present, but they're absent. They're present, but they're not registered, so to speak. In Pakistan, only last week, after Pakistan was formed in 1947, so some 60 years later, 60, 70 years later, only last week, the Hindus, which is a minority there, in India, Hindus are the majority, the Hindus got a right for registering their marriages. You could be a Hindu in Pakistan, and there are 3 million of them. You could be a Hindu, and you could marry a Hindu person, but you couldn't apply for a passport as husband and wife, because there was no such thing as registered marriage. So, that is the situation. One is the presence. Second is the perception of minorities. Minorities, by themselves and by the majority, are either stared at or not seen at all. Ralph Ellison's famous book, Invisible Man, is about this kind of matter, where people don't see some people. There's a very fine, small budget movie called Dirty Pretty Things, which is about the illegal immigrant clandestine labor in London. And in the movie, there is a dirty, cheap little motel where all kind of shady things go on. And there's a Turkish young girl, there's a man from Nigeria, and there's a man from, I think from China. These three people are coming out, 5 a.m. their shift is over, and they're coming out, and a Bobby, a cop, British cop, passes by, and he looks at them, and he says, "Who are you? I've never seen you." And the Nigerian man says, "Is it possible that you haven't seen us because we are the sort of people you don't see?" People don't see people. Like Andre Green's negative hallucination. They bump into each other. "Sorry, I didn't see you." "How come you didn't see me? I was there. And in fact, I was alive." But no, that was an old joke. Sorry. That was early. So now what happens is that the majority sees minorities with the staring eyes or doesn't see. The minority themselves feels walking in a place either acutely being noticed or not being noticed. And this is a very strange thing. So a peculiar disjunction occurs in the subjective experience between the figure and the ground. To explain this, I think the best way to explain this is the following. From 0 to 26, if today somebody like you writes a biographical sketch of mine, you would say, Dr. Akhtar was living in India. No, that's not a fact. I wasn't living in India. I was just living. I was just living. You are not living in the United States. You're living. There's a difference between living in some place and living. I'm living in the United States. And there are times that I forget that I'm living in the United States. Let's be honest about it. But it doesn't become unconscious, only preconscious. For example, when you speak, you're speaking. When I speak, I'm not speaking. I'm speaking in English. Those are not same things. Those are not same things. Do you see what I'm saying? When you belong to a minority, your experience, subjective experience, is slightly different than that of the majority. To begin with, the majority has a choice to associate with minorities or not. A white person can say, "I don't deal with black people." He's done. A black person cannot say, "I don't deal with white people." You have to. And that's not good. These are the kinds of things. So one is the issue of presence. Second is the issue of perception. Third is the issue of participation. Participation in various kinds of things. There are countries where minorities don't have votes. In this country itself, there was no vote for women for a long time. There was no vote for black people for a long time. So the people are living in a country which is a democratic country, and people cannot vote. That is just unbelievable, but true. That is absence of participation. Also, festivals. We celebrate festivals. And some of them get willy-nilly or forcefully recognized as somehow national festivals. But many of those national festivals do not represent a large number of people. Whatever is the politically correct terms, Native Americans, American Indians, whatever is the correct term, they came originally actually from outer Mongolia 32,000 years ago, but that's a different debate. Some of them could have been related to me. But now, what is that person to feel on Thanksgiving? Is that really he should be thankful for, crazy horse should thank Custer? I mean, come on, right? That is just mind-boggling. So that there are a bunch of festivals on 4th of July. Really, if you're really, really red-blooded African-American person, should you actually be celebrating 4th of July? Who became independent that day? Do you see what I'm saying? There are problems of social participation that have to be recognized and dealt with. So there is the presence of minority, there is the perception of minority, there is the participation of minority. Then there's also the progress. An African-American psychoanalyst who recently retired, she now mostly, I think, lives in South Carolina. She was in Washington, D.C., Dorothy Holmes. She has a very interesting paper called Success Neurosis, what does it have to do with race and social class? Freud had thought, not bad and not wrong, Freud had thought that those people who get destroyed by success or who destroy their own potential for success are doing so out of guilt. And in his good but limited vision, all guilt came from Oedipus complex. And actually what he says is that there are only two fundamental human crimes. One is incest and the other is parricide, meaning murder of the father, which implies killing the mother is okay. That was a joke, come on. Yeah. That was Freud's narrow vision, phallocentric vision. Parricide, meaning matricide, infanticide, filicide is fine. Kill your brother, sister, children, mother. Don't touch daddy. That's Freud's problem. That's not my problem. I think to update Freud, we should say there are only two great crimes, incest and murder. One is against family, one is against reality, or if you believe, against God. So that is the situation. Freud thought that all difficulties with success were related to guilt, and all guilt was related to Oedipus complex. This was a good, fine formulation for certain kind of neurotic people. Dorothy Holmes, in this very fine paper, Success Neurosis, what does it have to do with race and social class, points out that very poor white people who have grown up in very poor white people's families and poor African Americans, perhaps applies to Latinos also. When they begin to climb up in a social status, there comes a point where a particular kind of anxiety, a particular kind of guilt at having exceeded what was internalized as a ceiling from outer gaze and a particular disjunction from the original group stops their progress. And this matter is a subject for psychotherapy and analysis. One day, when I was in analysis, I came out of my analyst's office and I saw that my car had a flat tire. Just as a minor footnote, you can always tell by what kind of car a person is driving. Are they still in analysis or have they finished analysis? That is true. That is true. So I had this bullshit car, and so there was the flat tire. And I looked at the flat tire and reflexively, intuitively, not that I was thinking, please, this is a thought that occurred to me months and years later. At that time, it was just in the body, no thought, no mentalization. I wanted to do, later on, what I thought was what my father would have done. At that time, I was not thinking this is what my father would have done. It was just to do. That is to call a taxi, go home, walk inside the house, look at my wife, and say, listen, the car had a flat tire, it is on 49th and Market, get it fixed. That's just the right way of behaving in my family of origin. That's what my father would do. He wouldn't care what it cost. He wouldn't care, not that he was rich, but he wouldn't care what it cost. That's why he was not rich. But that just occurred to me. And that's why he was not rich. I just found out. Do you see? So now, that was the right way of behaving. He wouldn't deal with it. He let the wife take care of it. He wouldn't look at the problem till the time the car showed up, fixed up on the driveway. And his wife's problem. I decided to read the manual and try to see if I can change the flat tire. And I sat there in front of my analyst's office building, and I was, by God, able to change the tire. But when I changed the tire, and the tire was fixed and car was ready to go, I, on one hand, felt extremely strong, very masculine, very powerful. On the other hand, I had tears in my eyes, and I was crying, because I knew that I had become a very different man than my father, at least in that respect. That is what Dorothy Holmes' paper is about. That it is the pressure of an internalized glass ceiling. You are black, and therefore you cannot be this. The person reaches up to here, and that internalized dictate begins to act up. And also leaving people behind. Both these things create an inhibition of success. That's a very, very fine paper that needs to be looked at. All these problems of participation, progress, perception, and presence create a chronic, mild, and pre-conscious suffering in minorities. What is the solution then? First, there are 5 solutions. 5 solutions. First solution is the restoration of or the provision of civil rights. Everybody should have a vote. Everybody's vote should count, should have the equal weight. People should allowed to have freedom of expression, freedom of motility, travel, and such, and equal opportunities, and so on and so forth. 2 days ago, there was a big riot and big violence in India, in a state called Haryana, which is right next north to New Delhi. Why? Because the government of India had reserved a certain number of jobs, government jobs, for what they used to be called untouchables, and now have different names, but as an affirmative action. Now some people from higher classes are saying, we are not getting jobs because of these people. We want to be also called in the affirmative action. And they are like burning buildings. They kill 19 people. There's people who are not in the lower class, wanting to be called lower class, backward classes. There will be difficulties, but affirmative action certainly is required. The restoration of civil rights is definitely required. People cannot be trapped. People have to be allowed to speak and move around. That's the first thing, restoration or provision of civil rights. Second, recognition that the minority cultures have their own vitality, have their own meaning, have their own beauty, have their own goodnesses and badnesses. I was giving a talk like this someplace, and there's always a young man is always young, always a man, always in the back seat. I said something like what you were saying, that no country, no religion, no race, no people, no nothing is inherently superior 100% than another. Kid stands up, raises his hand. How can you say such a thing? In the United States, we have such and such rights, and this rights, and that rights. And in Saudi Arabia, women cannot even drive a car. And if you say one thing against the king, they'll cut your head off. Can you say that Saudi Arabia is as good a country as the United States? I happen to be very good at handling such shit. It is true. It is true. You can try me. I happen to be very good with this kind of thing. So what did I say in response? I said, you know what? Why did you pick these variables? Let me ask you a question. How many innocent civilians has United States killed outside of its geopolitical boundaries, and how many innocent civilians Saudi Arabia has killed outside of its geopolitical boundaries? And tell me which country is better. I said, you can do this to pick up a particular variable that suits your argument and then say, well, this country is better. No. Every country has goodnesses and badnesses, their own kinds. When I came to this country, people used to ask me, are there cows on the streets of India? I used to get all mumbled and neurotic and nerdy and everything. I don't get nerdy anymore. Can you ask me, are there cows in the street of India?
Are there cows on the streets in India?
Yes, there are cows, and there are also bulls, and buffalo, and goat, and sheep, and mice and rat, and spiders, and snakes, turtles, monkeys, dogs, cats, and if you're lucky, you'll certainly see an elephant, camel, maybe a bear. If you get really lucky, also a tiger. I mean, is there, like you're driving on New Jersey Turnpike. Did God intend this way? Cars and trucks and animals? No. And also, imagine this. I live in a very affluent suburb, in a big house. If I come out of the house, beautiful, 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 big trees, grass, everything. I can stand there for 50 minutes. That's 50 minutes, an analytic hour. I can stand there on the street in front of my house. No human being walks on it. Which is more weird, having a cow on the street or no human being on the street? No human being. The whole 50 minutes, not one human being is walking on the street. Why did we make the goddamn street? I don't get it. I don't get it. I go for a walk in my neighborhood, every single house, except mine, because I refuse to. That does not mean you get some hanky-panky ideas. Every single house has a sign, security by Westex, security by Franklin, security. Every person is living in the dread of being beaten, burglarized, raped, murdered. Is that a civilized society? I don't get it. I don't get it. Do you see? What happens is we see what we have as okay and what others have as not okay. The fact is, others are okay and not okay, and we are okay and not okay. So, first thing is to restore civil rights. Second thing is to acknowledge the minority culture's validity. Two. See, here with the two models appear, the melting pot model and the multiculturalism model. Melting pot model has an inherent defect, because the melting pot assumes the inherent superiority of the host culture, as against the multiculturalism, which permits, ultimately both end up same place. Ultimately both end up same place. But with a difference, the progress is slower, assimilation process is slower, and brings greater sleeve of the minority culture. Pizza. Is pizza only for Italians? Or soon sushi will become like that. And if you go to London, Indian food is like that. The best Indian food is in London, actually. That's a fact. That's a sad fact, but that's a fact. Unbelievable. Best Indian food is in London, and where's best British food? Nowhere. I just made this up. I couldn't resist it. I just made this up. That was not bad. That was not bad. All right, so 2, recognition of minority culture, civil rights. 3rd, acknowledging the role of majority in the problems of minority. Just imagine, if we are driving in France and there's a huge billboard saying, "We were in Africa first." Simple. We were in Africa first. How nice it would be. Imagine a sign in London, "We went to India first." And these Pakis, so to speak, the Pakistanis and Indians are here because of us. I think acknowledging the role that the majority plays in creating minorities' problems is an extremely important thing. The most shining example, of course, of it is the reparations for Holocaust, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and so on and so forth. So, one, restoration of civil rights. Second, recognition of the validity of minority cultures. Third, the acknowledgement of the majority's role. Fourth, making sure that minorities are part of the social iconography. I work in a clinic. I didn't find that. I am in a clinic and have been the director of an outpatient clinic in a medical school. I've held the same job, literally the same job for 37 years, which is a source of great amusement to my children. But the clinic has about 10 residents working in the clinic, and we have about a roster of 200 patients. About 70% of our patients are African American. About 90%, 95%, sometimes 99, 100% of our residents are not African Americans. In the clinic, there's a wall where all the chairmen's pictures are hanging. All of them are white men. There's not one picture in the clinic of any black person. This is just simply mind-boggling to me. When people don't feel that their faces, their voices, their skin color is respected in the fabric of the society, in movies, in television, in poetry, on billboards, then the person does not feel represented. When the movie came out, My Fat Greek Wedding, when the movie came out, Gandhi, all these movies, and there are now 5 cities I know of in this country which have prominent statues of Gandhi. I think this kind of thing restores minorities' pride and participation. I think Mr. Obama's election was a very good thing. Very, 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 very good thing. Not that it has solved the racist problems in the society, but it has made a very important gesture and a very important recognition that such things are possible. It is possible. So, representation of minorities in social iconography. In the names of streets. Now we have Martin Luther King Day. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. We have his statue now in Washington. That's a good thing. On dollar bill, we may have an African American person soon. We may not, but people are trying. Things have to happen like this. Street names, building names, festivals, holidays, and such. So that's number 3. Acknowledging the role of majority, providing civil rights, including the minorities in the social iconography, and recognizing the validity of the minority culture. The 5th thing, these things are in the hands mostly of majority. The 5th thing is in the hand of minorities. See, education and breastfeeding have one thing in common. Education and breastfeeding have one thing in common, and that is these are activities of two people. Mother can put the breast in the baby's mouth, but the baby has to suck. A teacher can be very well informed and teach, but the student has to listen carefully. Same way, while the majority has the major burden of improving the situations, the minorities also have to stand up. The phrase, black is beautiful, now that was a good thing. That was a good thing. To coin, the person who coined, I don't know who coined, I should have known, now that it occurs to me. Who coined that phrase was a smart person. That kind of thing has to happen. People have to stand up and demand their rights. When these 5 things take place together, then things change. Our country is full of minorities and rapidly changing. And we are seeing the anxiety of that change in some places, in East and Middle East, by the rise of fundamentalism. And in this country, by the rise of people who make tall buildings and put their name on it. Thank you. But it's the same thing. It's the same thing. There's fundamentalism of religion. There's fundamentalism of personal narcissism. But it's the same thing in which other people become total depositories of one's own evil, wicked, infantile, regressive, and repudiated parts. These 5 measures are intended to undo that traffic and to make the traffic move in the opposite direction. And then things improve. And then countries become better. No country will become all good. No country is all bad. But they become better. And as Gandhi said, that a nation is known for the way and in the way it treats its minorities. Thank you very much.